Hello, my name is Tom Thompson, and I am at Virginia Tech, a U.S. university. I'm a professor of agronomy, and my specialty is soil fertility. And I've had the privilege of working with ECHO Asia staff for a few years, and it's a pleasure to share now this time with you. And I look forward, I hope, to meeting some of you in during the live interactive sessions. So I'd like to talk today about soil fertility management for smallholder farmers. Just to tell you where I come from and what I've done, I've been a professor my entire career, but I've also been able to work with agronomists and small farmers and others in countries like the ones that you see on the screen, as well as others. And those have been great learning experiences for me. And I'm privileged to share some of the information that's resulted with you today during this talk. We're talking about this because of the importance of smallholder farming. I think many of you may know this, but small and medium farms produce up to 3/4 of the world's food. And so the fertility of soils and the ability of soils to provide nutrients are critical in these situations. So I'm pleased today to be able to share some of this information with you. Now, one thing I want you to know, as one of my soils professors taught me during my education, is that soils are not dirt. There is such a thing as dirt, but dirt is soil that's out of place. And soils are definitely not dirt. So let's please remember that today. So here's what I'd like us to talk about today. One is, what are essential nutrients and where do they come from? How does soil formation and soil properties influence soil fertility? We need to talk about nutrient balance for crop production, maximizing nutrient availability and soil fertility for smallholder farmers. And I also want to say a word about sustainable intensification, because it often comes up in these kinds of discussions. So there are a total of 17 essential plant nutrients, and many of you have probably heard of macronutrients and micronutrients. And the macronutrients that are most familiar to us are N, P, and K, but calcium, magnesium, and sulfur also qualify as macronutrients. And then there are micronutrients, and most of these are metal elements: iron, manganese, copper, etc. Now, these are not called macro and micronutrients because macronutrients are more important. This is simply a function of how much plants take up. So plants take up higher quantities of the macronutrients, smaller quantities of the micronutrients. Essential nutrients function in specific plant biochemical processes and can't be substituted for by other elements. This is an illustration that I often like to use. I've used it in classes I've taught on soil fertility for my entire career, for example. On the left is an analogy that we often call it the barrel. It's an illustration of what's called Liebig's law of the minimum. Liebig was an early German agricultural scientist who described the essential nature of nutrients and other things that contribute to plant growth. And what he said, in essence, was what the barrel is saying here, and that is, whatever is most limiting to plant growth will determine the yield. And in this case, it's the stave or the boards in the barrel, and the shortest one is the one that determines how much water that barrel can hold. And that's a good way to think of nutrients as well as other factors such as sunlight that can influence plant growth. Now, on the right is a graph that comes from research in Burundi, and I think it is an interesting illustration of this same concept. So the bar on the left illustrates maize yield when essentially all nutrients were supplied in, I assume, adequate amounts. And so you can see there was a maize yield of about 5 tons per hectare. Now, the next bar is removing dolomite, which is a source of magnesium. And you can see that in that case, the yield dropped by a ton. If you remove potassium, the next bar, or K, it doesn't change the yield very much. If you remove sulfur, it doesn't remove the yield very much. But if you remove zinc, boron, and copper, that is the last 3 bars on the right, then yields drop as low as 3.5 tons per hectare. So what this illustrates is it can be, in some situations, either one nutrient that can limit yield, or in some cases, it can actually be multiple nutrients that limit yield. But it is not always nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium that limits crop yields. Where do nutrients come from? The most common source, if you will, for most plant nutrients is it comes from weathering of naturally occurring soil minerals. So minerals are essentially chemical compounds in soils that are inherited from the parent material of the soil, which may be a rock or maybe sediments. And as those weather, due to what we call chemical weathering under the influence of water, temperature, those slowly dissolve, some more slowly than others. And many soils, though, of the humid tropics are highly weathered and have low amounts of nutrient-bearing minerals, such as phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium. Now, nutrient release through soil mineral weathering is not what we call a sustainable nutrient source, because essentially that's a form of mining nutrients from soil when we remove nutrients that are naturally occurring and we don't replace them. Now, in fairness, there are some soils that can, for some nutrients, withstand dozens or even hundreds of years of mining without impacting plant growth, but that's definitely not true for all nutrients. So understanding nutrient removal and the capability of the soil to supply those nutrients is really crucial for understanding soil fertility. Nitrogen fixation from legume crops or cover crops is another source of nutrient. That, of course, comes only with certain kinds of plants, legumes, of course, which may be cash crops, cover crops, what we call green manure crops. But the biomass has to be kept on the soil for maximum nitrogen benefit. If that biomass is removed, the above ground biomass is removed and, say, fed to livestock or something, you don't get that nitrogen benefit back to the soil. Crop residues, manures, and composts and so forth can be sources of nutrients, as of course can fertilizers. So the nutrients contained in soil minerals or organic materials may not be available to plants. So it's one thing for nutrients to be present in soil, it's another for them to be available. Plant available nutrients are nutrients in soil that are soluble or dissolved in water and accessible for uptake by plant roots. Plant available nutrients are going to be limited, or many times will be limited, because soils are nutrient depleted, and that's especially common for soils that have formed in humid regions. And this is why we use fertilizers, whether it's organic or inorganic fertilizers. Other factors like drought and soil pH and salinity may also limit nutrient availability. So, where do soils come from? Well, we talk about the 5 soil forming factors. The parent material is the rocks or the sediments that soils came from, climate, biota, which are the organisms in the soil, vegetation and microorganisms, topography, and time are the 5 soil forming factors. I like it said this way by Wendell Berry, who's kind of an agricultural poet. It is the nature of soil to be highly complex and variable, to conform very inexactly to human conclusions and rules. It is itself easily damaged by the imposition of alien patterns. Out of the random grammar and lexicon of possibilities, geological, topographical, climatological, biological, the soil of any one place makes its own peculiar and inevitable sense. And because of the interaction of these 5 soil forming factors, we get soils that look as different as these do. Each one of these soils has different properties and can tell us a different story about how it is formed, and will have different levels of soil fertility depending on the parent material and the interaction of the other soil forming factors. Now, in this talk, I'll be focusing mostly on soils of the tropics and the subtropics, And you can see from this map where those are. And so if we look at a map of soil classification around the world, this is the US system of soil classification. And focus for a moment on soils of the tropics. And I think you'll notice in the humid tropics, you'll notice a couple of different soil, what we call soil orders, and there are 12 of them around the world that dominate in the humid tropics. And that's this red one, which is called an oxisol, and also yellow. You can see yellow colors in and around the red colors, especially in South America, in Central Africa, and you can see a lot of yellow colors in Southeast Asia. Those are called ultisols. Ultisols they commonly occur in moist subtropical climates. They're highly leached acid soils that are often yellow-orange in color. Oxisols are the most highly weathered soils that form in humid, tropical, and subtropical climates. They're also acid and typically yellow-orange in color. Now, the story is different in the arid and semi-arid tropics, but we don't have time to talk about that. pH is a very important soil property that helps to govern the fertility of soils and the availability of nutrients. And you can see in the humid tropics, say in South America, here in Central Africa, and in Southeast Asia in particular, that soils tend to be acid. They tend to be in the range of pHs of 4 or 5, maybe 6 in some cases. And that's very important for soil fertility. And here's why. Because we know that soil pH affects the relative availability of plant nutrients. So if you look on this graph, the relative width of each bar represents the availability of those nutrients as a function of pH. The ideal soil pH from the standpoint of plant nutrient availability is typically between 6 and 6.5. Soils of the humid tropics and subtropics will often be below 6. Soils of the arid tropics and subtropics may be closer to 7, or what we call neutrality. So pH is very important. So let's talk about just a few of the nutrients. We only have time for a few highlights. The first one we think of course, is nitrogen. Nitrogen is the nutrient that's most often limiting to plant growth. In soils, nitrogen exists mostly in soil organic matter and in crop residue, so mostly in organic forms. That's one reason it is so important to maintain and increase soil organic matter. There's a lot of good reasons to do that, but one is it's a significant reservoir of nitrogen for plants. You can add nitrogen to soils naturally through nitrogen fixation by legumes that are used as crops, green manures, and cover crops. And of course, you can add nitrogen in the form of chemical fertilizers as well. Phosphorus is another interesting element, and I'll tell you, in most soils of the humid and some subhumid tropics, phosphorus availability is often the biggest bottleneck. I like what this slide says. Isaac Asimov, who's a late science fiction writer, said that phosphorus was life's bottleneck. Life can multiply until all the phosphorus is gone, and then there is an inexorable halt which nothing can prevent. We may be able to substitute nuclear power for coal, and plastics for wood, and yeast for meat, and friendliness for isolation, but for phosphorus, there is neither substitute nor replacement. The last bullet says there is no phosphorus equivalent to nitrogen fixation. So remember that. If we mine phosphorus from soils by growing crops and harvesting them, or grazing animals and harvesting them, we are removing phosphorus, and there is no replacement that we can take advantage of. It has to be imported from somewhere to add back into the soil. This is just a dramatic example of what a phosphorus deficiency can look like. The areas where the maize is stunted, there was no phosphorus supply. Potassium is another one. The last nutrient we'll really be able to talk about specifically. And in this case, you can see the black areas are soils depleted in potassium. And you can see this lines up almost exactly with a map of the humid tropics and subtropics. Pardon my coughing. So, put all this together. What are some common soil fertility properties of crop soils of the sub and humid tropics and subtropics? Many of the soils are acidic with a pH of 5.5 or below, and in that range we can have aluminum toxicity. and the only way that we can solve that is through neutralizing the acid. By adding lime is really the best way to do that. Many of these soils have low organic matter and therefore low soil nitrogen. Many of these soils are low in plant available phosphorus, low in plant available potassium, low in boron and chlorine. Maybe high availability for some micronutrients. So what I'm talking about here are sort of the native soil fertility properties of these soils. Management can change some of this. Good management can change soil fertility for the good, and poor soil management can change it for the bad. Let's talk about nutrient removal. In crop harvest, this is the amount of nutrients, NPK, we would remove per ton per hectare of grain yield. So you can see the values differ. For beans and peanuts, which are both legumes, the nitrogen removal is higher. Now, of course, when those plants are fixing nitrogen, they can supply a good bit of that nitrogen. And so just kind of keep these numbers in range. When you harvest, you are mining these nutrients from the soil. And this is just for the grain. If you are also removing the residue, the maize stover or whatever from the soil, you're harvesting additional nutrients. Let me give you a few examples. In sub-Saharan Africa, millet with a 1.5 ton per hectare yield will remove 42 kilograms of nitrogen in the grain and 21 kilograms of nitrogen in harvested residue. These are not high yields. 1.5 tons per hectare is not a particularly high millet yield, of course. In Southeast Asia, a 3-ton rice crop will remove this much in grain and this much in residue that is either harvested or burned. In South America, this is an example for potatoes, and another sub-Saharan African example with peanuts with 1 ton per hectare. So perhaps the numbers themselves are not terribly important, but I want you to please remember that when we harvest that crop, we are mining these nutrients. And if we don't replace them one way or the other, then we are depleting the soils of their fertility. This graph shows some examples of incorporating groundnut or peanut residues into soils. On the top 2 groups of bars, 1996 incorporated and 1997 incorporated, you can see that around 30 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare was available to the next crop from these peanut residues. If you burn the residue, practically none. So it's very important to maintain crop residues on soils if at all possible. And I understand that that may be a challenge in smallholder situations because of the demand for fuel or for fodder for livestock, or perhaps in some cases even for fencing materials. So plant available nutrients are also naturally lost from soils by chemical weathering by rainfall, erosion, and crop harvest and livestock grazing. The first one, chemical weathering, we have relatively little control over, but we do have some control over erosion of soil and then how much nutrients removed by crop harvest. Plant available nutrients can be added to soils through natural processes by nitrogen fixation, return of crop residues, adding manure or compost, and dust that comes naturally. I want to make a comment about returning crop residues to soils. Crop residues, manures, and compost. If those were generated on the farm, you are not adding net nutrients to the system, you're simply recycling them, okay? Those nutrients that are in crop residues had to come from somewhere. They came from the soil. Unless you are importing those organic amendments, you are not increasing the amount of nutrient. You're recycling it, which is a good thing. But remember, you're not actually adding nutrients if that's what you're doing. Okay, so the bottom line is that soils used for crop production experience a net loss of plant available nutrients unless legumes are part of the crop rotation, but that's only effective for nitrogen. Unless manures or other organic materials are imported from outside the field or fertilizers are added. Nutrient replacement is essential for sustainable crop production. Although soils differ in inherent fertility, there are no soils anywhere that can support sustainable crop yields indefinitely without nutrient addition. Nutrient addition is most severe in Africa. Annual nutrient depletion rates, you can see this is from 2002, but I don't think it has changed since then. It adds up over time. I'll just say that. So how do we build soil fertility in smallholder farming? First, we try to avoid nutrient losses, reducing soil erosion with continuous soil cover and returning the highest possible amount of crop residue to soil. That's part of conservation agriculture. We add nutrients to soil, maximizing nitrogen fixation with crop rotations, cover crops, green manures, agroforestry, whatever method is possible. Intercropping with legumes, trees, and forbs. Returning manures and fire ashes to soils and using fertilizers at the right rate, time, place, and source are all ways to add nutrients to soil. And we need to try to minimize other limitations to crop growth, such as acidity. And again, a lot of this is conservation agriculture. We found, Patrick Trail authored this paper. Patrick worked for ECHO, and he was a graduate student at Virginia Tech once upon a time. And in his research in Senegal, semi-arid Senegal, we found that intercropping millet with any kind of bean really increased the millet yield. And of course, we had bean yield as well. So intercropping is practiced in some places by smallholder farmers, but it probably should be practiced more. And especially if you can put a legume into that intercropping mix. I'll talk just for a second about fertilization, and the approach I like to suggest is what's called the 4R approach for plant nutrients, and that is applying the right rate. The first one is the right rate as established through soil and plant tissue testing and other methods. The second principle is applying at the right time as established through knowledge of when plant demand is the highest. 3, apply at the right place so plant roots can access that. Think of microdosing if you're familiar with that. And then finally, use the right source to minimize nitrogen losses. And this is a very good framework for efficiently using fertilizers. This is the nitrogen cycle. And some of you have seen this before, and I'll only say that it helps to illustrate just how dynamic a nutrient nitrogen is, because nitrogen can cycle through different forms and through different reactions in soils. And so nitrogen can pretty easily be lost from soils, both naturally, and we can see accelerated loss when we mismanage nitrogen. Nitrogen is really unique in this respect, and so it's the most challenging nutrient to manage and to manage it well. Just a word about phosphorus. Phosphorus, again, is a bottleneck, and it is depleted in many tropical soils, especially humid tropical soils. And that is because it weathers out, and that is because as the mineralogy or the minerals change in soils as they weather, they have more capacity to grab onto phosphorus and keep it in a form that's unavailable to plants. And so a pH that is between 6 and 7 is usually ideal for phosphorus availability. And at pHs below that, phosphorus becomes less available. At pHs above that, phosphorus becomes less available. So again, another good reason for managing pH through lime or other applications. So let's talk about fertilizer for a moment. I've worked with fertilizers my entire career. Fertilizers are somewhat controversial in some circles. Personally, I think they're great tools. They have revolutionized agriculture in many ways. Broadly defined, a fertilizer is any substance that's capable of providing plant-available nutrients. As we commonly use the term, we are usually talking about synthetic fertilizers, chemical, inorganic salts composed of plant nutrients. Most fertilizers are simply soluble salts. And we produce nitrogen fertilizers by taking it from the atmosphere and converting it into plant available forms of nitrogen. Phosphorus is mined from surface deposits and it's treated to increase solubility. Potassium fertilizers are mined from underground deposits and then purified and then made into fertilizers. Organic materials can also serve as fertilizers. Fertilizer consumption has, of course, occurred, really since 1950. It's grown tremendously, as has the world population. So obviously, fertilizers have made it possible for us to feed a lot more people in the world. So synthetic or chemical or inorganic fertilizers, that all means the same thing. They are not harmful to soils or soil organisms when used at appropriate rates, and that has been shown over and over again. They usually supply nutrients in the ionic form that plants use, and there's an advantage to that. Although access and affordability of fertilizers can sometimes be challenging, especially for smallholders, chemical fertilizers are highly concentrated nutrient sources. There are also organic fertilizers. Any organic material can be a fertilizer, including manure, night soil, which is human waste, food waste, etc. They also supply organic matter, which is a great thing. Chemical fertilizers do not supply organic matter. Organic fertilizers mostly contain what we call slow-release nutrients that have to be decomposed by soil microorganisms before they're available to plants. It's challenging, though, to find enough organics to supply sustainable levels of nutrient addition for crop production, except on limited scales. Actually, I'm going to skip to this slide to illustrate this. So this is a manure map of Africa and of Asia. And the orange areas are those areas where there's enough manure to potentially, if it's handled right and distributed right, to actually contribute significantly to plant nutrient needs. You can see there's a lot of those areas in, say, China and India and some in Southeast Asia, but only a little bit in Africa, a little bit in Kenya and in Ethiopia, and perhaps a bit in Sudan. The take-home point is, in most parts of the humid tropics, there is simply not enough manure to supply crop needs on large scales. It can occur at a household level, but you have to have enough livestock, and you have to collect the manure. Manures have low nutrient content. So say they're about 2 to 4% nitrogen, for example, whereas fertilizers can be up to 46% nitrogen in the case of urea. So obviously the nutrients are much more dilute in organic fertilizers. So there's a couple of different kinds we can talk about. Manures are excellent sources of nitrogen and phosphorus. However, they do contain too much phosphorus compared to nitrogen. And so long-term heavy manuring will lead to saturation of soils with phosphorus, and then that can result in water pollution if soils are lost through erosion. The actual nitrogen content of a manure will depend on handling and aging. Manures are a slow-release nitrogen source, but the timing of nutrient release is unpredictable, and it depends on the environment. When composts are properly produced, they are excellent sources of organic matter. They're usually less valuable as nutrient sources than manure, but they're excellent soil conditioners. But the challenge is often finding enough organic material to fertilize with compost a significant area. Maybe a kitchen garden, but an entire field may be very challenging. I'm just going to say a word about sustainable intensification, which some of you have heard of, and it's been touted as a way to increase production for smallholders. The idea is to intensify through providing more inputs and more intensive management, but in a way that's sustainable and takes into account social challenges and environmental challenges. Personally, I'm an advocate of sustainable intensification. the system of rice intensification is a form of sustainable intensification that I imagine many of you are aware of. It has its critics. I just copied this from a website that says that sustainable intensification is unsustainable. We don't have time for that discussion here, apparently. But again, I count myself as a proponent of sustainable intensification. But the way to do that is not the same everywhere. It needs to be tailored to individual environments and circumstances. The last thing I think I'll talk about is integrated soil fertility management. Integrated soil fertility management is a little like, it's another framework like sustainable intensification, which is the idea is taking into account all possible nutrient sources, managing them according to the 4 R's, and expecting, best outcomes from this. And this is from Malawi. Actually, it's an example of two different locations. On the left are, if there's no amendments added, you have yields of 900 to maybe 2,200 kilograms per hectare of maize. If you add manure alone or fertilizer alone, you have almost exactly the same results. You have an increase in yield at both sites. But if you add manure and fertilizer together, you get the best results at both sites. So this is an example of using all available nutrient sources, including inorganic and organic sources of manures, to achieve the best soil fertility outcomes. I'll close with this, and that is that small and medium-sized farms produce 50 to 75% of the world's food. All essential nutrients are important. Soils of the humid and subhumid tropics and subtropics are often nutrient depleted and acidic. Livestock grazing and crop production deplete soils of nutrients, and they must be replaced for sustainability. Proactive management is required to avoid nutrient depletion, and phosphorus can be especially challenging. So I want to thank you for watching, and I hope to see some of you, many of you, perhaps at the face-to-face or the virtual interaction time that we'll have. Thank you again, and thanks to ECHO for this invitation. I greatly appreciate it. Bye.